Ever since the beginning of time, people have been posting on the forums about premates ruining PvP. Now, I am by no means the first one to make a video on this topic, but since I see it coming up again and again, and the other day a viewer brought it up on my Discord, I wanted to give my 2 cents on it. Now, the argument usually goes, premates are ruining PvP, they should be banned from playing versus solo players. And BioWare has addressed these complaints in the matchmaking changes of patch 7.2.1, which included several changes to the matchmaking algorithm, whereby premates now are more likely to be matched against other premates, especially if going in big groups of 4 or more players. That being said, today I will argue why banning premates from solo queue is wrong, what I think the actual problem is, and some ideas on how we could improve it. So my first point, and this should be already the only reason you ever need to make in this argument, banning premates from PvP is wrong because Star Wars: The Old Republic is an MMO. And while it has catered more and more to the casual solo players in recent times, it is still an MMO, and one of the core elements of MMOs has always been the ability to form communities, which give players the possibility to make friends, group up with them, and enjoy themselves together in the game's world, be it via user-created events, raiding, RP, or group PvP. And that leads me into my second point, and that is that playing in a premade is much more fun than playing solo. Now, this is true for me in particular. I've played with the same group of friends for the better part of 11 years, and for me, PvPing in this game is now mostly social activity. Whereas other people go out and like to have a drink on Friday night, I prefer to stay home and PvP with my guild instead, because that's more fun. And contrary to popular belief, I do queue solo sometimes. I have a couple of videos on here where I am playing without a premade, but that being said, my point still is, if my friends are online, I will play with them because it's more fun to sit on Discord, talk shit, and just enjoy yourself. Next point. Playing in a premade is not only more fun, but it also makes it easier to improve at the game. Because your teammates will always know their main class better than you will know it. And that means you can learn tricks from them, you can duel them, you can learn how to counter their class 10 times faster than watching all of my class guides, leveling and gearing every class in the game, and then queuing solo for 3 years. And that brings me to my next point, and that is that the solutions that people are proposing don't work for multiple reasons. So the solution that I hear most often basically talks about separating premates and solos so that premates only ever play versus other premates and solo players only play versus solos. And the first problem with that is that premate versus premate queue does not work. Why is that the case? Well, simply said, the population in this game is too low to support it. So the queue times for these premate versus premate queues would be even longer than the queue times are now already, which means people would stop playing and the premade queue would die. And this is made worse by the fact that not all premates are of equal size. So a 4-man premate could never be matched with a 3-man premate because there would be no solo player to fill up the team. Also, we of course already tried premate versus premate queue in this game and it did not work. Maybe the new players here don't know that, but a long time ago this game had a premate versus premate queue and it was called group ranked. And it started with the 8v8 premate versus premate warzones. And in the beginning, that system was working quite well. But since BioWare took forever with the first ranked season, lack of balance changes, lack of bug fixes and release of other endgame content, people quit. And then the final nail in the coffin was the removal of 8v8 ranked with the introduction of 4v4 group ranked arenas. And now that arena system hung around for a while, and I played in it, it was actually some of the most fun I ever had in this game. But eventually what killed it was the same thing that would kill a premade versus premade queue today. And that is also that the player base is not big enough to support real matchmaking. So to explain what I mean, let's say there are 3 teams in queue. The number 1 team wins 80% of the time versus the number 2 team, but they are so good they win 99% of the time versus team number 3. So insane win rate overall, they have a good time. Team number 2, as I already said, 80-20, they win 20% of the time versus the top team, but they win 75% of the time versus team number 3. Meaning that, all things equal, team number 2 will have a somewhat balanced win rate, maybe around 50%. But, and here's the problem, what happens if you look at it from the perspective of team number 3. So team number 3 goes against team number 1. That's pretty much always an auto lose. And if they go up against team number 2, they win 1 in 4 games, which also does not feel good because it means that their overall win rate will be something like 1 in 8 games. Or said differently, 8 games, 7 losses. So now one of 2 things will happen, and that's exactly what happened with group ranked arenas. Team number 3 will either stop queuing altogether, or they will start to intentionally avoid, aka queue dodge, team number 1. Because they know that team number 1 is just too good and they don't want to keep losing every game. But if that happens, now team number 2 is the only team that ever plays versus team number 1, meaning that their win rate drops from 50% to 20%. And they will also stop queuing or queue dodging team 1. And that ruins the pre-made queue, because the worst teams don't want to keep getting farmed, which is understandable, and if there are not enough other teams in the queue so that even the weaker team can get a win every now and then they will stop queuing. And that's why pre-made versus pre-made queues don't work. They have never worked in this game. So if you introduce it, the players that are queuing pre-made today would most likely quit the game, or, and that is the second option, start playing the new solo queue. But that leads me to my next point. Solo queue also does not work either. Because remember, this game already had a ranked arena solo queue and it was very unbalanced. In fact, let me tell you a little story of the only time that I played solo queue arenas seriously. So that was back then when I was still playing on the German server. I was playing Serenity Shadow, which was quite OP at the time. I think it was patch 3.0. So I played arena every day. I got to 2000 rating and I was the rank 1 solo queue rated player on the German server by quite some margin actually. However, since everyone was playing Shadow back then, in order to get the top 3 title, I needed around 2.2 or 2.3k rating, I don't really remember exactly. And I could not get much more rating on the German server because the more rating you have, the less you will gain for every win. So I decided to transfer to Tomb of Freedom Nut, the main EU English server back then, with the highest rated players in order to compete for the top 3. But what I didn't know back then was that the Republic side on that server was all but dead. And pretty much all of the high rank players were queuing on Imperial side. And to make matters worse, these players would also queue sync, meaning they would sit in the same Discord, all queue up at the same time, and then most of the time get into the same ranked match, because there was also no cross-faction queue back then. And then you would pretty much have what you have now, which is a bunch of random solo players with no communication going up versus what is essentially a pre-made. Needless to say, there was not a very fun experience and I did not get my top 3. So to all the solo players that are complaining about getting farmed by pre-made, I have been there myself. But if you introduce solo queue at this point in the game, yes, there are cross-faction queues, but you would still have people queue syncing all the time, the people that are now playing pre-made, and they would get into the same team eventually and be in voice anyway. So, while it maybe would be a little improvement compared to back in 3.0, how I see it is that people are actually misunderstanding the problem. And that brings me to my final point. Pre-mates are not the problem, because the problem that people are complaining about is not that other players are grouping and playing together with their friends. The problem comes from the fact that good players like to group up with other good players. And there are not enough good solo players left in this game to build fair matches. The actual problem is unfair matchmaking, and it is of course related to pre-made versus solos, but pre-mates itself are not the underlying issue. What happens is that a pre-made of 4 to 8 experienced players queue up, and they are on one team and the game tries to find a match for them. But if there are no other pre-mates in the queue, eventually it will match the pre-mate versus 8 random solo players of, let's say, varying skill level. So, in theory, of course, it is possible that the 8 random solo players are all very experienced PvPers and they will beat the 8-man pre-mate. In fact, I have a few games on this channel where I queue solo into a pre-mate and win. Or let's say Kiddo and I queue into an 8-man pre-mate, we get some lucky teammates on our side and we win. So it is possible. But it does not happen all that often because there are not enough good solo players left in this game to build fair matches. And that sucks for both solo players and the pre-mates, because the solo players obviously don't want to get farmed as spawn, but believe it or not, the pre-mates also want to have fun, and at least most of them want to play versus other pre-mates and compete with them. And if you queue pre-made like me most of the time, you will notice that first of all, you have very long queue times. And once you finally get into a match, you either play versus the same 1 to 2 premates all evening long, or you get matched versus a team of 8 random PvP season achievement farmers who just right-click nodes or AFK for outfits, none of which is very fun. So how do you solve that problem? Well, I mean, the best fix would be just to get more people to play the game. I don't know, maybe release new content, new maps, interesting rewards, actual balance changes, maybe a new class, bug fixes or performance improvements that makes people want to play PvP. That's not something that we can solve, that is up to the developer, of course. Second thing is to improve the average skill level, also for solo players, which is of course what my channel is also about. Next idea to improve matchmaking would be to basically make everything ranked. So if you win a lot of games, maybe you perform well, get a lot of damage and medals, your rating will go up, and you will have worse teammates and play versus better opponents. And if you're new, you will play against other new or lower rated players. And then you could couple that with some improved LFG tools, similar to PvE if you queue up for a flashpoint where you can select 2 roles, let's say tank and DPS or heal and DPS, and then you queue up for PvP, right? And that system would put you in a group, so new players can immediately see, okay, that's my healer because he has the healer icon over his head. That's my tank, better stay close to him. And if it works and you have a good game, you should be able to queue again as a group, or at least have a feature to easily chat with them, add them to the friend list and say, GG, well played, want to queue up again as a group or something like that. Now, is that realistic? Maybe not, but the game still has a strong pull for new players whenever there is a new Star Wars thing coming out. So I think if the new developers were to focus on it, I think it could be done. But at least some long overdue improvements to the new player experience need to be made, because PvP does have quite a learning curve, and the game itself doesn't really teach you anything about the mechanics of PvP. So, if you're a new player and you want to get better at the game, I recommend 3 things. First of all, stop whining and complaining about premates ruining PvP. Step 2, check out my playlist Introduction to PvP, which teaches you all the basics you need to know. And step 3, join a guild or start your own premade. If you're on Daf Malgus, you can join our community guild Frog Dog Farmers, which is open to everyone who wants to find other people to PvP with. We're also planning to do guild internal premade versus premade PvP matches, where we want to make sure that some of the more experienced players get some of the more newer players on their team, so we can make sure that the games are balanced, where we do, let's say, a 3v3 or maybe even an 8v8 if we find enough people, with custom matchmaking in our guild, so we can ensure that every new player gets matched with an experienced player and so on. And then for the next game, mix up the teams so everyone has the chance to play with different players, play different classes, and have fun without being farmed at respawn all the time. If you're interested and you want to join that, leave a comment under this video or join my Discord. I will send you a guild invite. Link to that is in the description below. And as always, guys, if you enjoyed this video, please remember to leave it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.